And here we go. I'm Stuart Cantor. We have Maggie Raymond. We're both from Bishop Lynch, and we have Dr. Bjork here with us from Arizona State University. And we're going to talk a little bit about Beowulf, of which you are an expert in, have been studying Beowulf for quite a long time, have written extensively. First question, why the continuing popularity of a poem 1,500 years old?
I think the essence of this poem is psychological, and it has to do with how a human being negotiates life. There's something very psychologically real about what happens to Beowulf. In the first part of the poem, he's a young man. He can do anything. He accomplishes a great deal, and the future looks pretty bright. Then we skip 50 years, no mention at all of what happens in those 50 years.
Right.
And then we have him at the end of his life, and things don't look as good. And he's lost strength. He's blaming himself for some of the calamity that has come down upon his people. He's doubting what he has done in the past. That's what happens when you get older. You start examining what you've accomplished in life, and you've seen what you actually haven't accomplished as well. And there's something very psychologically real about tracing Beowulf through an entire lifetime that's pretty appealing to all cultures. There's also the battle with demons, and the demons that can symbolize just about anything horrible in your life. The monsters in Beowulf have been variously interpreted throughout the history of our knowledge of the poem, which really only extends back to 1815 with the first edition of the poem by Grimir Thorkelin. He published an edition with Latin introduction and Latin facing page Latin translation. So our knowledge of Beowulf only goes back to really 1815. But the monsters have been variously interpreted. For instance, disease, obviously associated with various kinds of evil, sexual appetite, and what sexual appetite can do unleashed to a culture. Just think of Helen of Troy and what trouble that sexual unleashing caused to an entire civilization. So I think it's a combination of the compelling psychological nature of the poem and the compelling nature of the demons that Beowulf has to defeat, and ultimately can't defeat the final one, the dragon, who is immeasurable, has lived beyond our comprehension of a lifetime, and is 50 feet long, and probably is associated with that ultimate cosmic evil that is going to do us all in. It may be called COVID.
Great. COVID-19. That's all we need. We've already on the lookout for killer wasps now.
Exactly. Yeah. Something will get us.
It's funny you mention, his cognizance of his mortality. I wrote down a note this morning. It was not a question that I sent to you originally, but I added to it, and it goes right with what you said, that Beowulf is portrayed as a superhero, and our students will realize that early in the poem, the strength of 30 men, swims underwater forever, et cetera, et cetera. And then he turns out quite human towards the end. So what does this tell us, and what should our students look for in regards to our superheroes, our heroes in general?
How to extrapolate from Beowulf to the superheroes like we see in the movies now? Is that what you're asking?
Sure, or our heroes in general. I mean, if Beowulf is a hero, and in this case he's also a superhero, but we realize he's mortal, what do we take from this?
Um, I think we take what I had said earlier, that in our youth we all think we're not vulnerable to anything. So 16 friends in Florida say we're not vulnerable to COVID-19. They go out and have a good time at a bar and they come back and they're all infected. We don't know how many will die. We don't know how many will survive. But it's the hubris of youth that makes you do foolish things. It also allows you to do some great things, I think. But as you go through life, you become more and more careful. You see more and more ramifications of what you're doing and what the possibilities are for your current capacity in life. Uh, I think armies always recruit really young men, preferably 18 years old, because once your brain is fully developed at age 26 or so, you start seeing war is kind of stupid. And maybe I don't want to do that. Um, so you're harder to control the more you know and the more experience you've had in life. And that's why I think armies don't want to recruit really mature human beings, men or women.
Interesting point.
So I think the heroes that we worship in our culture now in the movies, I think we're worshiping them because we need a hero in the present world with all of the uncertainty of it. Um, Everything from COVID-19 to global warming to nationalist movements all over the world to movements on the right, movements on the left. There's a lot of uncertainty, and you never know when you might be in personal jeopardy when you walk out your door. And to see superheroes just being able to leap tall buildings and beat up really big monsters is a psychological projection of our fear of living life as we have to live it in the 21st century. That's my take on it.
Could I get you to kind of elaborate a little bit? You had talked about the villains, how there have been different interpretations of the monster. And I had read an essay by Toni Morrison that kind of shows Grendel as a marginalized or racial figure, which is obviously right now the Black Lives Matter movement, pretty strong in a lot of our students' heads right now.
Mhm.
I guess first off, what are your thoughts on the essay if you've read it? And then do you think it's appropriate to take those kind of postmodern viewpoints on something as old as this? Is it hard to differentiate our current culture with the culture that this was written, or at least in this case, 1815, translated in?
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess I would approach that from two different directions. One is just the nature of a symbol. To begin with, a symbol as opposed to a metaphor is endlessly evocative. There are really no limits you can put on the symbol until you put it in the context of the poem. So you can look at Grendel and Grendel's mother as disease, and disease can be, I think racism is a disease. It's a psychological disease, and the fact that they're marginalized creatures, and the fact that they are very closely tied to humans in the poem. In fact, Grendel is, you asked about Seamus Heaney's translation.
Yes.
I love that translation, not least because it's done more for Old English studies than anything else in the world ever. Nobel Prize winning poet. It was on the New York Times best-selling list for 2 or 3 years. It did a tremendous amount for the study of this literature. But that was a digression from what I was just saying. Well, he and other translators have translated terms for Grendel and Grendel's mother in the poem as monsters. And the poet actually calls Grendel a wanselig wer, which means unhappy man. And there are no epithets really that translate as monster for Grendel. So he's an unhappy man on the fringes of society for whatever reason, for having murdered somebody. We're not sure, but there's a definite connection. And the connection is emphasized in the fact that he and his mother attack the hall, which is the symbol of human civilization.
Right.
But animosity towards something means dragons don't have animosity for civilization because they want to be part of it. They're just annoyed. The dragon missed a little piece of jewelry from his huge hoard and just destroyed everything. There's nothing personal against the society. There's not that kind of connection, but there's a connection with Grendel and with Grendel's mother. So if you think of them as the racial outcasts, I think that works, but only to a certain extent, because ultimately, well, they end up getting destroyed, and there's a sense of gratitude towards Beowulf for his having gotten rid of those monsters. So you can take it only so far, but I think it's worth doing just to see how far you can take that kind of reasoning. I personally think, and maybe you can tie this discussion into the racial discussion in a contemporary application of the poem. The poem obviously has a lot of contemporary power, or it wouldn't be translated into so many languages in so many different language groups, and be translated so recently as 2018. That's the most recent translation into English. The most recent translation into a language it hasn't been translated into before is 2019 into Sami, the language of the Laplanders. It's not a direct translation from the poem. It's a translation of actually a retelling of Beowulf, but it's now made available to Sami speakers. And that tells you that there is something very powerful about this poem. My feeling is that the monsters represent what's destroying the Germanic culture that they're coming out of. And the Germanic culture is based on feuding. So
Right.
you kill somebody and we're going to kill someone in your tribe. And that
We're guild.
That will never work. It will end in the death of everybody, right? So I think that in these monsters, there's a projection of that anxiety and that culture about what the central tenet of the culture is. Racism in our culture, I think, can eventually destroy us, because it's a lethal kind of disease that's very stupid, and if you examine it, you can see how much damage it's doing on all levels of culture. So in that way, if you look at the monsters in Beowulf and they're symbolizing what's wrong with the culture, I think you can move the discussion of the racial association of those monsters a little bit farther along. So it's complicated, but I think it's definitely worth talking about because the poem speaks to us and speaks to thousands of people around the world, from China to well, all over Europe. There's I think there's a Brazilian translation. I'm not positive about that. I need to look back at that article that I sent you on the perception history of Beowulf. But that, if you look quickly at that article, you'll see that the simple poem in one manuscript housed in the British Library, discovered in the 1780s, and then edited and published in 1815. From that one text, the power of Beowulf just went everywhere in the world through scholars, first of all, then translations into multiple languages, then translations into films, into television, into music, into art. It's just permeated our culture in a way that few myths have permeated our culture, including Roman and Greek myths.
That's true. And with all the different translations, and you said there's even one as recent as last year, with all the different translations, with all the archaeological excavation going on to continue to find Anglo-Saxon treasure hoard in Europe, what do you, as a scholar of Beowulf, what do you continue to learn about the poem?
I've taught it many, many times, and every time I teach it, every time I read it, I find something new in the poem. And that actually is the mark of great literature. If you can go back to a play of Shakespeare, and obviously we all do that, every time you go back and read Hamlet or Othello or whatever you're reading. I just finished teaching Macbeth again with undergraduates. You see something new. You're enriched by it because you're growing. You've read other things in between time, and the ability of major world literature, the timeless world literature like Shakespeare or Beowulf, to transform you every time you read it is what really marks it as great literature. There are some novels, some poems that we've read and we'll never read again. Even if we pick them up, we'll say, nah, I don't need to read that again.
True.
I've learned what it can teach me. And I could list a number of such books, but there's no point in it. You understand what I mean. But other books, you will continue to come back to, and that's what happens with Beowulf. You also asked me about what film version I prefer, and I referred to it an animated classics in the it's animated classic Beowulf. You can get it on YouTube.
Okay.
It's really faithful to the poem. It tells the poem in a respectful and exciting manner. I showed it to my 13-year-old daughter. She thought it was great. She was studying Beowulf at the time. So in terms of fidelity to the text, that would be my favorite one. And a Beowulf scholar at Cambridge was the advisor to that on that particular rendition. And I think there are some other famous names associated with it. Um, so that would be my favorite one. I recommend you recommending that to your students.
All right, I will look that up because you also mentioned you liked the version with Anthony Hopkins and Angelina Jolie, and when I
And,
first saw that, I'm thinking, all right, Neil Gaiman didn't even read the poem.
well, I like parts of it.
Okay.
There's the introduction of Grendel when he first comes to the hall. Um, there's a lot of the terror that you get in the poem that's replicated in the film version. Um, in the poem, he just touches the doors, and they explode in front of him,
Right.
and that happens in the film. And then um, in the poem, he rips a warrior apart, drinks his blood, and eats his body, even to the feet and hands.
Right.
And you see that in the film, and it's kind of blood curdling in the film. But, so what I like about what the film has accomplished in those instances is to translate the terror that we can no longer feel of the original audience, because we read the text and say, okay. Translates it into a medium that we are familiar with and that we can derive fear from, and does it in a pretty successful manner.
Because they almost make Grendel in the movie like a really angst-ridden teenager.
Yeah, well, yeah, there's a lot about the movie that I don't like. But it's specifically in some of the local effects that we no longer replicate when we just read the poem, even if we're reading it in Old English. We don't get that sense that a listening audience would have had sitting around a fire inside a hall, surrounded by darkness, surrounded by all the evil things they know that are in the darkness, they know that are in the forest. And the forest is where evil things live. And in fact, in Swedish, you don't say go to hell, you say go to the forest. It's,
Really?
yeah, dra åt skogen. And it has the same force if I said go to hell to you. You know, that's offensive. Dra åt skogen, it's offensive in Swedish. And that goes back to the fear of the things in the dark forest that characterize the early Middle Ages. So we can't replicate, except when we're kids sitting around a campfire and telling ghost stories. You may be able to replicate kind of the fear that the original audience had. But I think Zemeckis does a good job of that in the medium that we're used to, that we're used to being afraid of this stuff.
Right.
And in 100 years, people will look at it and say, there will be some other way to terrify us.
Right.
And make it real. But for fidelity to the movie, that animated classics is really quite good.
All right, I'm gonna have to find that one.
I also like the 13th Warrior, just
I
because.
love the 13th Warrior.
Yeah, just because if you read Beowulf and then you read Ibn Fadlan's account of his journey to the Rus,
Right.
and then you read Eaters of the Dead, and then you see the movie, you see this amazing articulation that works extremely well. Some people see the movie and think, oh, that's really dumb. That doesn't work at all. But
yeah, but he's just expanding that single scene.
Yeah. And by the way, Beowulf has been interpreted. I mean, Grendel has been interpreted as, and you'll see this in the Icelandic Beowulf and Grendel, has been interpreted as a primitive human, a Neanderthal, in serious literature. In one of the first reviews of the poem in 1817, a German reviewer articulated that point of view. Has been interpreted as a cannibal, so the cannibals in the Eaters of the Dead makes perfect sense as well.
Yeah, because in Hebrew, I read an article in Hebrew. Grendel goes with the term creature,
Mhm.
kaim for creature.
Oh, right, right. Yeah, that works. And the Zemeckis film, it was panned by a lot of people because of Angelina Jolie being in it. Well, in the French edition of the poem by André Crépin, this is in the 1980s, I believe. But he interprets Grendel and Grendel's mother as being, especially Grendel's mother, as being sexual appetite.
Hmm.
So her appearing as Angelina Jolie or as a former playmate in the other Beowulf film that came out around the same time as
Beowulf and Grendel?
Warrior, the one with the Highlander
Beowulf
guy.
and, oh, the Highlander? Oh, I know what you're talking about.
Yeah. Anyways, Beowulf's Grendel's mother is played by a former Playboy playmate in that one, and people think, oh, this is just Hollywood trying to sell movies with sex, but there's also real scholarly interpretations that would justify just that. There's almost nothing new under the Beowulf sun.
Do you think that that part kind of ties in with the balance between Christianity and paganism that you kind of see throughout the book as well?
In what way?
The sexual appetites, if we're talking about like pagan rituals versus kind of Christian new coming in and trying to tell people how they should do these new rituals, these new behaviors, and new ways of society.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's possible because in Norse culture, out of which the stories of Beowulf come, they worship the three main deities, one of which is Freya and Freyr,
Right.
god of fertility, and during the 9-day festival of sacrifice at Uppsala, 3 days would be devoted to those gods, and the way you worship those gods was to have orgies, drunken orgies, and so I think those 3 days were the most popular of the 9 days of sacrifice. Um, but attached to fertility is the sexuality, which, as I said previously, if it's unchecked, if it's unleashed, can be extremely damaging. It can do a lot of harm to a society, right? But if you're released to do whatever you want sexually for 3 days because you're worshiping your gods, that's okay. If you do it when you're not worshiping your gods, that's not okay. Adultery is bad, not just because it's in the Ten Commandments. It's not a smart thing to do. You know, you're creating a situation that can only result in pain and perhaps violence and damage to your society in some way. So, yeah, I think that it does tie in. That would tie in with the heathen versus Christian elements in the poem.
I want to piggyback on that for a second and ask you a question that I sent you in an email, because it's apparent there's a lot of Christian overtones that go along with the prior pagan culture, and yet Jesus is never mentioned.
Right.
Most of the allusions are actually Old Testament, be they
Right.
Moses, etc. So is it wrong to actually say that the poem has a Judeo-Christian influence?
I don't think that would be wrong. The poem in its original form, whatever that was and wherever that took place, there's a new book that came out in Swedish in 2018 that argues that the poem was actually written in East Sweden
Hmm.
And then was um, trans well was carried over to East Anglia um, by Swedes, and then eventually was reworked in English culture. But the original poem probably came out of the pagan tradition, and when it's reworked in the context of a literate society, such as the Anglo-Saxon society after 597, after the Christianization
Right.
of
Pope Gregory.
England, um, the person writing it down perhaps interjected. Basically, it's the Cain and Abel story,
Right.
right? Um, Grendel is associated with Cain, and Cain and it probably saw that this story from the Bible makes a lot of sense with this story from wherever it came from, because this has to do with murder. It has to do with feuding. Why is Cain mad at Abel? Well, there's kind of a feud going on for love, God's love, right? So Abel gives God something that he likes more than what Cain is giving God, and that makes Cain want to kill Abel, which he does, and so he introduces murder. When you introduce murder into a culture, that culture is pretty much doomed. It just begets more and more murder. So I think it's the Judeo part of Judeo-Christian that's really interjected in. It's the Old Testament Cain and Abel story that really is most pertinent to Beowulf. But it was injected undoubtedly by whatever Christian monk wrote the poem down.
Right.
But didn't feel, Beowulf has been interpreted as Christ, by the way. A Christ symbol.
Okay.
A
That
Christ
makes
figure.
sense.
Yeah, it makes sense until the end of the poem when he dies.
Right.
And his whole tribe is destroyed because he died. So you can only take it so far. But I don't think, personally, I don't think that whatever Christian wrote down the final rendition of the poem actually injected any Christian dogma into the poem. The only thing there is from the Old Testament and in the Cain and Abel story.
What should students know about the two major digressions that take place in Beowulf?
There are actually a number of digressions. Which one do you consider the major ones? The fight at Finnsburg?
Go ahead.
The fight at Finnsburg?
The fight at Finn's. You learn about the Dragon Slayer. You've got these two big digressions that last a couple hundred lines.
Okay.
What are their intentions? Why does the poet break up the flow of the story with these digressions?
Okay, good question. We are used to reading literature in a post-Aristotelian world in which there's a beginning, middle, and end to a story. This story doesn't work that way, and it's not based on Aristotelian aesthetics. I explain this to students this way: that Old English is a compounding language, which means that you have one word that means one thing. So we have whale, and you know what that is? A creature living in the sea. And then you have road, and that's something that we travel along. It's man-made. You put them together, and you have whale, road, ran, rod in Old English, and you have a new concept. The whale traveling across the road, which is the ocean. So the ran, rod, the road of the whale, is the ocean. It's a metaphor for ocean. You'll see that in a number of words in Old English. Old English poetry is composed of a long alliterative line, usually with, basically it's 4 beats to the line and 3 alliterating words binding 2 half lines together into a full line. In the middle, there's a strong caesura, a strong pause. Quat we gardena in year dagum, theod kuninga, trum jefrunon, hutha ethelingas, ellen fremadon. You can feel a strong pause in each line. Frequently, the lines are juxtaposed in a way that you achieve a meaning beyond the paraphrasable meaning. So, for instance, you have the first half line talking about Grendel, and the second half line talking about his grim nature. So Grendel and grim, Grendel and grind, alliterate, and that gives you a broader sense of what Grendel is. Grinding, grim creature. Then in the poetry itself, so you have words juxtaposed, giving you a sense beyond the individual words. Half lines juxtaposed, giving you a sense of the whole line beyond the individual half lines. And then you have chunks of narrative juxtaposed. So you have the introductory digression on shoal chafing.
Right.
And then you jump in, that's juxtaposed to the story of Herod and Hrothgar.
Right.
And you think, what's going on here? And you have to pause and ask yourself, how do these seemingly disparate parts actually fit together in the poet's mind? So then I give an example from one of the gnomic poems, the maxims in Old English, to show how this works. It goes, Wea beth wundrum klibor, wolk nu shlithath. Woe is extraordinarily clinging. Woe, psychological pain clings to you. Clouds glide. And you read that, what does that mean? Well, if you think it through, woe, psychological pain, is human and it clings to you. A friend dies and you have that pain and you can't get rid of it and you may never get rid of it. The clouds outside, they just glide by. The universe doesn't care. It's the indifference of the universe that's expressed by that juxtaposition. Well, in Beowulf, you have these digressions that seem just random. But if you think of them in terms of juxtaposing that story to the story of Beowulf and figuring out what's going on, you'll see a clearer relationship than you might have otherwise. So, for instance, in the Finnsburg Finnsburg episode, Finn and all his men are fighting and trying to get away, and men on both sides are killed, and they're all put on the funeral pyre, and the funeral pyre just eats them all. Doesn't care what side they're on. It's like the coronavirus again. Doesn't care if you're a Republican or a Democrat or if you're, what country you're in. If it gets you, it's just going to get you. It's indifferent to any qualification. So then you see that this is a burial scene that needs to be juxtaposed to the first burial scene of shoal chafing. Remember, he was put in a boat, set on fire, and pushed out to sea.
Right.
Well, that's pretty idealized compared to this real funeral pyre with the wife just in agony because her son and nephew are on the funeral pyre shoulder to shoulder, and then the flames engulf the flesh, and you hear the blood boiling and spurting out of the body. It's really grotesque
True.
in comparison, and you say, well, this was idealized, this was not. Then you get to Beowulf's funeral scene at the end of the poem, and you realize there's another burial scene, another expression of grief, and this one is even more terrifying because with the death of Beowulf comes really the death of his entire people. Because
Right.
once he's gone, these tribes are going to move in and enslave or kill everybody.
Yeah.
So that's how I deal with the digressions. You ask yourself, why are we seeing this really awful queen who will have someone killed if he just looks at her with lust, right? Well, juxtapose it to the other queens you see, Wealhtheow and Ugd. They, in comparison, they are really good queens. And even if there weren't that comparison, they would be good. But in comparison to the really bad queens,
Right.
they are much better. So that's how I encourage students to read all of the digressions, not as disruptions of the story, but as a kind of commentary on the story that requires you to work at figuring out what's going on. The Anglo-Saxons and the Scandinavians really loved riddles, and so there are a lot of riddles in both traditions, and even the Old Norse kennings are kinds of riddles. Like here's one: young pine tree of the arm serpent. What does that mean? You can see them sitting around the fire going, drinking their beer and eating their rats, whatever meat they could get. And pine tree, that's like a person. Arm serpent. Oh, women wear arm bracelets that look like serpents wrapped around their arms. It has to be a young woman. So that's a kenning for a young woman.
All right.
So their poetry, I think, even the big poems like Beowulf, need to be pondered in that light. There's a riddling quality. There's the basic aesthetic device or function of juxtaposition that differentiate those poems from anything we're used to reading.
Gotcha.
I feel like I've talked your ears off.
I didn't know if Maggie had a question real quickly or not.
Honestly, the last question I kind of had was kind of for the students, if you wanted to kind of pitch Anglo-Saxon studies in general and why they should study it in college next year.
Well, I think there are a couple of reasons. One is that the medium of conscious life for human beings is language. And we should be as aware as we possibly can be of the language that we speak. And that means being aware of its history, being aware of the fact, for example, that a lot of people think that we're moderns now, so history doesn't have anything to do with us. Forget the Renaissance, certainly forget the Middle Ages. There's nothing there. We're moving straight ahead. If you just look at our language, you realize that a huge percentage of the words that we speak were spoken 1,000 years ago. Just look at the days of the week.
Yeah.
Monday, moon day, that's fine. Tuesday, the day of Tiu, which is a Germanic god of war.
Right.
Wednesday,
Odin.
Woden or Odin,
Yeah.
Day of Odin. Friday, Freyadag. That's why, thank God it's Friday. Freya is the god of fertility and sexuality, etc. So studying the language actually makes you more cognizant of the language we now speak and how embedded it is in history. A lot of our culture is really embedded, especially in medieval institutions. The university itself is a medieval institution. You go to a university, you're going to something that was invented thousands of years ago, not thousands, but hundreds of years ago. So that's what, the other thing is that it's extraordinarily beautiful poetry. When I went to UCLA to get a doctorate, I was going to get excuse me, I get choked up. I was going to work on Faulkner because I especially love As I Lay Dying.
Okay.
But and I still love Faulkner. It's an amazing writer. But I took Old English and I found it so fascinating, so difficult, and so beautiful. The intricacy of the art easily matches Faulknerian art that I decided to switch. And I'm really glad that I did. There's a lot to be discovered in Old English language and literature.
Well, on that note, bringing it back to our students and our current modern times, sort of the way we started off, I have no more questions. Miss Raymond?
Good, thank you.
Well, thanks for inviting me. I hope your students enjoy Beowulf.
I think what's really important, and which is why we greatly appreciate you giving up, half hour, 40 minutes, is that because we teach seniors, they're going to be on the college campus shortly.
Right.
So it's, like I said, we're greatly appreciative that they get to see that, that they'll be interacting with college professors soon enough.
Right.
And they're tired of listening to me by now, so.
I doubt that. You both seem very... You're both teaching on the senior level?
Yes, sir.
Yep. Well, Beowulf is a great text to teach, and you never get tired of reading it.
I love it.
And if they love it in translation, they'll love it even more in the original. That's another good reason to learn Old English.
Sounds great.
Okay.
Sir, we appreciate your time.
Thank you.
And I appreciate yours. Thank you. Good luck.
Thank you. Have a good day.
And stay masked.
Will do.
Yes.
Great. Bye-bye.